Matthew Trenhaile, welcome back to the Business of Betting podcast.
Glad to be back, Jake. Congratulations on your million plus listens.
Thank you. It's a strange thing to think about, and it's hard to track and follow, but you know what I can follow, it seems like a few people have listened, so that's pretty cool. And I think recently going back and chatting with people a second time, I realized we hadn't spoken in a long time, so it's going to be cool to cover a few things. Just tell us, you've kind of been very much on the grid for a while with your own podcast and certainly plenty of musings, all things betting. What's been the impetus to change that, and then how's it gone for you?
Well, what happened is I bought quite a lot of shares in after timing and hindsight smugness. So when Corona came along, I just pretty much made more money than I knew what to do with after that. As that seems to be the trend of the analysis. It's very close to bookmaking in many ways. So, so I did a fair few podcasts, I want to say 16 or so, and I was on Twitter and quite active on Twitter. But I increasingly found that Twitter for me it's a bit like betting in that the real fun of betting is being right, and money is just the way of keeping score on it, really. So you want to see how often you're right and to what degree you're right. And, money in betting pretty much gives you a good track record of that. But with Twitter, I treat it almost exactly like bet. I like to be right. And the thing about Twitter is that no one pays you. So you can say something, it's right, or you're pretty sure it's right, or you've got quite a good, backup or experience, or you've spoken to the people relevant. So you're pretty happy with right, and people will go, yeah, maybe. And you're like, fuck, no, I need you to say, yes, Matthew, you're completely right. Now that I see it from your point of view, and the moment you need that from social media, the moment you know that you're incapable of using social media in a healthy way, which is pretty much me. So I would get caught on Twitter or after a podcast, people leave comments or whatever, and if you're just, I don't know, narcissistic, or just all you want to hear is people tell you, oh wow, I never realized that. That's really cool. You're bang right. You're so smart. Oh gosh, you know so much. Then it's not a healthy way to sort of interact with it, I guess.
So you don't miss recreating the discussions around the Pinnacle model in the US these days?
No. Well, I don't miss that. And I've always missed, and it continues to be whenever I listen to people talking about betting and people talking about models of bookmaking and how to do it, I always miss the next level of analysis. So the discussion on that often revolves around, high volume versus low volume, high margin versus low margin, closing accounts versus not closing accounts, profiling to move your odds, profiling to close accounts, all these sort of elements. But no one does the rather mundane thing of actually going through the process, talking about it. So for me, it's like, okay, so for starters, if you want to talk about all bookmakers should do X, you've got to put yourself in the bookmaker's shoes and go through the process. So the one thing that I always find interesting is like, bookmakers should be, let's take any sport, college football, let's say. And they're like, so I want to be able to bet well in advance of kickoff, and I want to bet in at least, $1,000, $2,000, $5,000, whatever, however chancy the person talking about the subject is, and on a side. And, the bookmaker should then be able to use that information to shape their book and make loads of money. So, I make money, they make money, I make them more money, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, well, let's walk through that. So you come on well in advance kickoff. So all the recreational punters haven't even thought about placing their bets. They're not even going to think about doing it for another 12 hours, whatever. And you place your bet, and the bookmaker who's decided to take everyone on takes that bet. And it's like, right, okay, what do you do? Right, okay, well, I've taken my max liability on this and I got to move it. And so the question is, well, how much do I move it? And that is a difficult question in and of itself. Do I move it past the key number? I move it just a little bit? Do I look at the rest of the market? Do I trade it independently of the market? And the truth of the matter is that if you move that and you don't take another bet from anyone up until the recreational money comes in, and when the first recreational bet you strike is at the same price as the rest of the market, all you've done is lost money, because you would have got there with the rest of the market without taking that bad EV bet. That EV bet has not shaped your market. You've gone 10 hours with the right price, but didn't take any bets. And so then we come back to, well, how can you generate positive EV off that negative EV initial bet? And it's like, okay, so I take that bet off whoever the smart guy is. And then I maybe hope to get maybe some arbitrage trading. And it's like, okay, or maybe it'll be someone else who's smart, because I've got a reputation. I lay smart customers. So the second person comes in. Now, if they're smart, by definition, they think the price is wrong. So if you think they truly are smart and you have them to be smart, then they've had another negative EV bet for you off you. And on the process goes. Whereas if it's arbitrage, someone just playing a difference between you and the rest of the bookmaking world, well, you can try and encourage that arbitrage. I've often said that I thought Pinnacle basically was doing a reduced juice kind of model in order to drive as much arbitrage versus recreational bookmakers, because their price was sharper and they would generate that buyback. And often they'd be able to generate that buyback net overall at a better rate than the negative EV bets they laid to smart people. But this whole process of like, how would you, all these professional gamblers, well, how would you move your odds? When you move your sides, how much do you move your totals? Do you move your totals? It's not, even if we use something simple, like, I don't know, if you did money line, you can do this in a different way. So money line implied probability adds up to 100% when you remove the juice. And you could use literally, like, I don't know, you call it binary search. So you start at 50-50. Someone goes, what team A, 50%, right? So we now know it's between 50 and 100%. So we go 75. And then someone now goes the other team, right? So it's between 50 and 75. So, and you narrow it down. And the thing about this binary search method is it does not actually take many bets for you to get to the right price. But of course, every single bet you took prior to that right price was negative EV to a degree. And the truth is that there is some drift past true price in this discovery method, but the drift past is never as big as probably what you've given up in negative EV at that point. So at what point do I get to exploit my better than the rest of the market quality price? Because I don't get to exploit it by laying recreationals at better quality odds, because they come at the end of the market anyway. They already come when the other 200 bookmakers or bookmakers or 1,000, depending on how big your geographical pool is, have all got to their own price discovery point, and you all lay your bets to the recs at roughly the same time, roughly the time when you need to have had massive marketing spend to try and get those people to bet with you as opposed to the other guy. So it's literally wastage, as far as I'm concerned, for many people. How much brand value can I attach to being the guy who's happy to lose some money to the sharp guys and probably not get much out of it? It's a lost leader in my mind. So how much has Pinnacle gained over the years by people betting with them, even recreationals, because they have the reputation of winners welcome. Winners welcome. They don't seem to use it quite as much now, but winners welcome very much used to be their standardized sort of banner, advertising riff kind of thing. If you're Circa Sports now, making a big noise over in the, certainly on the American Twitter scene, how much value can you attribute to being the guys who doesn't turn winners away? That is completely up to speculation. And what's the value in the UK, or what's the value of that in Australia? It's like in Australia, I would suggest, I suppose it depends more on your cultural attitude towards betting. So if you're like Central European country where the average bet size is very small, and you just like to bet in €2, bang, bang, bang throughout a live game, then having the reputation of being the guy who lays all these bets, what's that worth to your brand? Who knows? Australia, giving everyone a fair shake. I don't know if that's the Australian phrase, but there's this kind of attitude towards everyone should get a fair look. And also I don't know if I'm being here, but it's quite a macho attitude, it feels at times, in Australian bookmaking, so you should take a decent sized bet, quote, decent sized bet. So I can see how being a brand, so Top Sport, I think, is the guys who sort of make a point of saying how, they'll take on some of the sharper punters. I can see how that might actually have brand value. Now, the States is a different market. I've never said that I suppose the US is not different, but I do think in many ways a lot of the betting, the way of betting is done around the world will become de facto the rule in America as well, simply because it was being refined and is the best way of doing some things. But the one thing is definitely under question is how much that integrity of fairness valuation, I say fairness, again, I would debate about, where fairness lies. But, there is this debate as to how much brand value can you extract by being the guy who lays big bets, etc.
What about other jurisdictions? We get caught up on the US, but have you encountered the same question, or how would you think about it in another place or another country?
Okay, so you want to run the Pinnacle model in Sweden. Okay, well they're going to put deposit restrictions on you, no bonus restriction. We're already going into a world where the protection of problem gamblers is almost going to dictate your betting model ahead of any other decision you make. Cost of data, a lot of these people who can afford to take bigger bets from, people who can afford to take on potentially the high volume, low margin models are people who maybe don't have to worry about paying quite the same bills as other people. That's been well discussed, and everyone just assumes like, well, you just keep turning over the volume, just need more volume, and then if it's small margins, like what happens is as you crank up the volume, the margin just shrinks and shrinks as you crank up the volume. And it's because, do you know where there's infinite volume? There's infinite volume from people who are really fucking good at betting and still make money. They can continue to turn more and more money. And the people who don't make money, well, they don't deposit anymore because they lose it all and so on. So it's like, it's like if I went on Betfair and I said, right, I'm going to lay every horse at 1,000 in this next race, I can get the volume. It's like getting the turnover if you're doing things that actively put you at a disadvantage or negative EV is really easy to do. It's like, giving out free bets. Like, yeah, we've got 4,000 new signups over, the past day. And it's like, yeah, but did we do it with anything that has any longevity or forward-thinking positive EV for the business?
Right.
So I never really found anyone who was wanting to engage in that. And also there were times when I had information, I suppose, that in the back of my mind I was like, I know you're wrong there, but I tried to keep some integrity and didn't want to say on Twitter, actually I know so and so works there and you're talking shit because they don't do that or something, because then you really look like a smug prick, and it's like, again, no one gets much value out of that.
Right. Well, maybe we can get you on Joe Rogan sometime soon. You can do a 3-hour pod out in California and get into all this. But I wanted to, as you were describing just before, I wanted to ask about the theory, the odds theory, the price theory, or the price discovery theory. Has that evolved much? Has that been shaped throughout the decades? And last time we spoke a lot about, your time in spread betting, and I think IG Index it was called back then. Those trading rooms or offices were probably deep in discussion, decades ago now about all these types of things. I'm sure has obviously the idea and the function of placing a bet and laying a bet hasn't changed very much from, hundreds of years ago back at the horse track or anything like that. But has the theory of these things been have you delved pretty deep in certain conversation and seen it change, or is it still pretty binary in a lot of the discussions, and it's still pretty shallow once you get into the real details?
I certainly think that always the philosophy was that price discovery should be done as cheaply as possible. And that may sound like a really obvious thing to say, but we certainly, when I look back at old spread betting, people use this phrase marker. And I love it when, massive professional gamblers say, why don't they just use me as a marker? And it's like, yeah, you know, markers probably in the old days, and in my concept of markers, they genuinely did pay for themselves. And when I say that, it's like, let's say IG would open up, let's say you could have £100 a point on a spread market, and they called up in the morning, first thing. So we used to have a phone line that we'd turn on at 9 a.m. They'd call up and they'd say like, oh, can I sell £10 a point? And, people used to give all this fucking bullshit, like gentlemen bookmakers, always so nice. Like, it's not nice. Guy just wants to make money, but it just has a risk appetite that happens to suit your price discovery. And that's great. So this guy would be like, you'd look at him and he like bets in £10 a point and he's made like 200 grand over the last 3 years. You're like, fucking hell. That was great education in that, if you're good, you can make a living off reasonably small stakes. But, people were trading things where they knew the parameters, they knew the boundaries. So like right now, we trade sports where we could be, the lines that get put up could be 2 or 3 standard deviations fucking wrong by the time we get to closing line. But back then, let's say it was supremacy goals in a soccer match. It'd be like, okay, so we're trading it at, zero point 0.4 to 0.6 or whatever. Sells £10, which that really would be a tiny bit. Sells £10 at 0.4. You knew that it's like 0.3, maybe 0.2 at best. You kind of knew the limits because it was a Premier League game or whatever it was, and we were only trading in good stuff. And yeah, those people existed. They seemed happy to bet. And I think the closest I get to now for these kind of people are kind of like the home spreadsheeters. These guys who they got some shots on target data, whatever it may be, and they're probably going to get a better price than your opening price, but probably a worse price than your closing price. And some of these guys, they're just sort of learning. And again, but even then, those guys now seem to, the get rich quick generation, even they now are like banging limits on the openers across as many bookmakers as they can. But, they were sort of the kind of people, the hobbyists, I used to call them, the people who'd would give you a good steer as to where maybe you'd missed something on the stats or something like that. And like how you do prices, like, as I say, when you've got sort of a multivariate sport, something which has pace. So like, basketball is there's many different ways to play basketball. Many different like geographical variations around the world and styles of play, pace of play. And so you've got totals and spreads, and, they're connected to each other. There's implication, when someone, backs the home favorite or the road dog or whatever it may be, they're not only making an opinion about how good one team is, but possibly the way the match is going to be played. Price discovery. I don't think anyone's really come up with really great ways of doing that. You can take a bet and then you can simulate your liabilities off that bet, which off only one bet's not really an interesting exercise, but you can simulate, what should I move my odds to minimize the liability. And when you've only taken one bet on one side, invariably it's just like, well, I just move the side. But as these things evolve, if you want it to be really smart, there's a good reason that Pinnacle, like for years, soccer correct scores. Soccer correct scores is one of the greatest fucking margin bets you can lay in bookmaking. And you're thinking to yourself, right, because, they've this nice situation with the Asian handicap and the totals, and they just got to move things in one of two directions. And then suddenly someone bang comes in and says, I want $500 on the 1-0 with one team, and you've laid something at 6-1 or, plus 700, whatever it may be. And you're like, right, what do I do now? Well, it's 1-0, so I move the unders, but he's backed that team. So he's backed that team, but that's the favorite. So that makes the favorite more likely to win. You get into the situation where I don't think there are necessarily, without knowing exactly what's in the punter's mind who placed the bet, it's hard to do price discovery. And we now have huge arrays of derivatives. It's like these pricing models in 2008, which completely fell apart because there were so many bits, they didn't really understand how they interacted with each other. And it's like if someone backed Brady yards, how does that affect first quarter totals? It's like, you've got to kind of get inference. And there's, there are people out here very smarter than me saying, oh, well, statistically you can infer this and do that. And yeah, absolutely you can. But it just requires a huge amount of effort compared to just having roughly good prices that, non-professional bettors, don't beat you on anyway. So price discovery in terms of like, it feels like it's become more expensive unless you force it down. So like Pinnacle reduced their limits on their openers, load of things. So they reduced the cost there. To me, that's not a stupid thing to do. And you're having to infer price discovery across a wide range of, derivative markets and player props now. And yeah, it's just generally got harder. I mean, you're doing it on sports where there's much lower confidence in the sports, and yet there is, the constant. I still staggered by the obsession with being able to lay big bets as sort of a thing. But the American market always confuses me. What is it, like the median US salary is, I don't know, $50,000 a year, whatever. Take out car payments, house payments, children's food, whatever, taxes, what does that leave you as disposable, let's call it entertainment income at the end of the month? And how much, people are saying like, I can't even bet $1,000 on this. Like, Jesus Christ, and it's like, unless you've saved several years to get a big bankroll, I just don't see why this should matter to you. And like, even the American market has much higher average stakes compared to the rest of the world. But the funny thing is, so much of the American market is a product of its evolution. So if you went on holiday to Vegas, right, you might have a $5 parlay. But if you were going to have a single, and even people don't realize, even the odds in America make you want to bet $100. Because the fucking odds tell you to bet $110 to win 100. Everything about it says have this bigger stake on, and you're on holiday, and you're in Sin City, so everything has spiraled out of this one really sort of small inbred petri dish of betting to the rest of the American market. But yeah, so this average bet size, people want, the price discovery becomes harder because people want to open up with bigger than they should limits, and the people are sometimes reluctant to scale the limits. I think that's changing, thank God. I think there once was a time where people were like, well, I'm going to take $500 on this. Does it matter if I take $500 on this 3 days before or 3 hours? It's like, yes. It's like, oh, okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the diversification aspect as maybe a bookmaker would think about it? Or have you had those discussions? What type of thoughts are going into that given all the current circumstances?
We've never had a more diversified portfolio of sports, and coronavirus is definitely showing us that with the huge bookmaker offerings that are coming up now with all sorts of crazy things. But they're individually poorly diversified. So you take one bet on one CSGO match, whereas, once upon a time you may have only had like, say, the Premiership football, like Bundesliga and like NFL, a handful of things, and you'd be sort of, go back far enough, you wouldn't even be diversified there. There'd be one game that was the standout game, and you'd be heavily loaded on one side. But now you sort of get this illusion of diversification. But the reality is that on each individual game, you can have even more lopsided positions than we've ever had before. And quite often they're just one bet. And that can sort of create an illusion of safety. So, you look at it and you'd be like, oh, great. We took, 100 bets on this, NBA 2K friendly where the pros play or whatever. And you're like, oh yeah, it seemed to be spread across the games. Like, oh, hang on, we've only taken like 5 bets per game, exactly 5 bets per game, right? Oh, and it's the same accounts that placed 1 bet on every game, and like suddenly it dawns on you, like, oh, I'm more fragile than I thought, because once upon a time you just were like, hey, we lost on the horse racing, we're going to win on the soccer tonight, and it's kind of like, they genuinely did feel like you couldn't post a losing day in bookmaking. And while, still efficiently diversified, there can be like pockets of fragility within your offering.
So tell me about the Corona world. The mainstream, thought on this is that you shouldn't be betting on things you don't know. And certainly the aspiring, sports bettors out there should be, saving their bankroll for time in the future, let's say, and that all seems to make some sense. But from your perspective, what has this world brought to us, and what's the bookmaking perspective, the betting perspective? What type of viewpoint do you have on what this has all brought about?
Well, there was a huge, desperate attempt to get new content in. We lost, 90% of the content for a bookmaking site. And so suddenly you've got this huge spray out of coverage. And it's not really coverage. There's not much derivatives going on. There's a shitload of matches. No one really knows quality levels. Like, no one can tell you whether that small Brazilian e-soccer league is better or worse quality than it is. So in this huge period of uncertainty, this is probably one of the few times where, yeah, I get it. Like, if you're a guy who's used to using massive data sets, you've learned your art, you're really good, you build a simulation for the NFL, the rest of it. Yeah, okay. If you want to say, guys, do not bet at this time, fine. If you're someone who basically has good contrarian instincts, who can just watch a little bit of sport and intuit something that's wrong about the odds, it is literally a golden age. I would say to the imaginative, creative, savvy gambler, there's never been a better opportunity than right now. You've got infinite number of sports. Every time you place a bet, match after match, you look more and more like an addict. No one's turning away turnover. Limits are up on stuff that's got very low confidence levels. Crypto bookmakers are cranking this stuff out. God, you don't even have to put your bloody email address in. Just, everyone is going absolutely, crazy to survive this. And like, if you're telling me that, the people who are odds compiling this stuff, the scant few, who everyone obviously takes an aggregate of their prices up, if you're telling me the one or two guys, Bet365's eSoccer guide is like the authority on eSoccer on the planet, probably not. It's just probably not correct. So, and people I noticed the one sort of narrative that people come up with is people like sort of say, like, oh yeah, I found out it was pre-recorded, or like people are like, right now when a bookmaker is hurting, the last thing they fucking want is some prick, having them over on this kind of shit. Like, so I wouldn't personally recommend that, for betting longevity or whatever, especially when it's far easier just to watch, Nicaraguan soccer or Belarus, Nicaraguan soccer. Like, fuck, it's really hot in Nicaragua, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, I'd get tired. Yeah, and these guys aren't like top pros. Like, well, what are the total goals? Do you think the total goals are right? Like, a good example is this, like lower division Brazilian soccer. It's really fucking hot, and the goals they've got a different goal distribution in really hot countries where it's really, people play the game at different pace of play. So someone who's already like just good at watching a sport can like watch Nicaraguan, or maybe the Belarusians got a particular style, or maybe they look and it's like, do you know what? These referees don't get cards out for anything. It's like, all right, so how does that? So if the referee can't be influenced, what does that mean for home advantage? It's like it's by far and away the most enjoyable betting intellectual game right now, from my perspective, from what I've observed and monitoring liabilities of different bookmakers, there's ever been. It's like, I think the people who saying, don't bet now are possibly being a bit unimaginative.
Interesting, because we always talk about the soft spots of the books. We talk about the derivatives. We talk about trying to look at areas they may not be focusing on. And it seems like in this world, everything in that bucket has pretty much been propelled to the prime time, and limits have changed. Expertise hasn't necessarily changed with it. And there may be an opportunity like you're describing.
Yeah. I mean, derivative people are rightly nervous of derivatives. Just the idea that, that I get reports and I get to see matches which have moved, the odds have moved between opening and closing, a million reports I received, but a number of odds that have moved over a certain threshold between opening and closing. And you've got to remember that these matches have odds up for less time than a normal fixture would do, and yet the number of matches appearing on this report is just through the fucking roof. So, there's just extreme volatility. And when the volatility is that big, you don't even have to be maxing out the limit, if you find a nice little angle on NBA 2K or on, whatever it may be, something with a high turnover of fixtures, the e-leagues or, esports are on the more conventional esports. You only need to be betting in. Don't get me wrong, like if you're a big syndicate and you've got like a large amount of bills, like fine, furlough your developers and your traders. Well, I guess there's like, but if you're someone who's happy to take home the equivalent of a reasonable salary a year from your betting, you absolutely now should be, in my mind, at least looking at those kind of things rather than just, what's the one I hear a lot of? People just like, I'm going to overhaul my models or I'm going to learn Python. It's like, yeah, we all fucking say we're going to learn things in coronavirus. And,
yeah, we just drink more and watch more Netflix probably. But do you have a sense of what, let's just say this calendar year, 2020, will have on the overall market moving forward from a bird's eye view? Do you think that it'll accelerate the contraction? It'll have an impact on the bookmaking side? It'll change the dynamics moving forward?
For me, it's hard to say what's going to have a bigger impact, the virus or the increased attitude towards problem gambling. Different for different areas. I suppose like the US is still young. If we get NFL back, I think it probably doesn't change dramatically. It's kind of like back to the level of evolution that they were. But for some other nations, lockdown has prompted this look at, people are worried about people being at home and betting too much, especially when they don't have the money because they've been furloughed or whatever. So I think increasingly you're like looking at all these, so things you observe, bookmakers shutting down affiliate programs. I think Tipico was the most recent big German bookmaker, was the most recent one shut down their affiliate programs. So affiliate programs are shutting down. And Scandinavian governments in particular, utopia dictates that we don't have too many problem gamblers. So they're putting in laws about deposit limits and maximum bet size. But, it's like that could change, that could drive certain geographies into a sort of state where the business model more than ever becomes about having millions of customers who bet €2 a time or £2 or $2. And those businesses are quite unsustainable a lot of the time, or they're sustainable, but it's more practical to merge into a bigger entity. And so, yeah, I can see. The funny thing is that like a lot of people said like, oh, one of the discussions I have at the moment is people are like, oh, we're going to keep offering all this extra coverage, more fixtures than we did before coronavirus. And it's like, shit. Okay, so it's going to be hard, bearing in mind, staffing levels are, pinched. It's going to be hard to be offering the same kind of stuff. And if anything, you might get a slight contraction. So you might lose all the stuff. Sorry for those people who became big fans of all this other stuff. You might get a contraction in that. And people may also need to save money by reducing the packages of data they buy or the extra stuff. So you may get sort of a contraction in bookmaker offerings and sort of more of a focus on the sports. Although some of the stuff may survive. I mean, I'm not being funny. I don't think anyone is complaining about the margins on some of this stuff. Like table tennis is a good earner, really is. So, I can definitely see some stuff. The global landscape of offerings, changing a little bit. But again, we'll be keen to keep more of the live stuff, and in particular, if it falls in a slot where there's nothing else to bet on. But in terms of industry, struggling financially, some bookmakers, because yes, everyone's integrating virtual sports, people are taking on all this new coverage and so on. But you can't get around the fact that the people who bet have less money to bet with. And I know everyone loves to say like, oh, betting's the last thing to suffer. And it's like, well, the $2 parlay guy, yeah, he might. But the funny thing is, a $2 parlay guy, let's make gross assumptions about the social demographic here. The $2 parlay guy might be more at risk of his job, potentially. So if he's got no job, he's probably not having the $2 parlay. But if he's like slightly reduced, he might keep doing. But the guys who are like, white collar, a year salary guys, those guys who maybe bet $100 or £100 a game or whatever, they're definitely being impacted, and they're the ones that actually pay for their cost of acquisition of accounts. So let's say in different jurisdictions, cost of acquiring a new account can be $100, $200, $300, whatever it may be. I think, as much as $500. You need someone to deposit, for starters, at least that amount, and hope that they lose it all. So the percentage of your open accounts at any given time who are actually making you money as a bookmaker, unless you have some huge scalability, means that there's going to be, you're going to get pinched pretty hard now. And so consolidation would seem to be fairly inevitable, I guess. But yeah, it's hard for me to. I mean, they signed off. You probably follow the Flutter Stars merger's all done, dusted. Yep. Is that right?
Yep, finalized. Yep.
Yeah, that's all done, dusted. I mean, that does seem to be ties up. It's funny, that you can sort of, if you're a sports betting service, the number of invoices you send out is definitely dwindling for the same amount of websites, if you like. I think that people have various estimates based on when full inverted commas proper sport comes back. But Bundesliga, it would be fascinating to watch. I mean, I'll be glued to Betfair when Bundesliga, May 16th, I think it is.
Yep.
That's going to be just absolutely fascinating, because you can almost be certain that, all the big players will be out, and they'll all be speculating on, if home advantage is deemed to be predominantly referee driven, and if referee response is predominantly driven by crowds, right down to crowd proximity, and there are no crowds, people will have been making, thumb in the air guesses at what home advantage has been impacted. I'd be interested to see the odds moves, kind of geek I am, I guess, and turnover and all that other stuff. It's going to be really interesting. I remember when when I want to say one stage of the lockdown, there was only UK greyhounds really in the UK left. And I remember watching the first bags race. These are things that normally have I don't know, they can range from 10 to 30,000 turnover. Just seeing the turnover take off as everyone's looking to turn their bots onto something or turn away to something, and then the Bundesliga is going to be just like this in massive scale.
Absolutely. So one general topic I wanted to ask you about, which I don't think necessarily gets a lot of coverage or deeper discussion, is just the zero-sum nature of the betting markets. And some people talk about the markets that it's bettor versus bookmaker or punter versus bookmaker. Others, from the professional angle say, well, if you're making money out of this, you're just taking money out of the pockets of the recreational gamblers, and the bookmakers are clipping the ticket on the way through. And it's funny that it doesn't necessarily always land on a consensus. I think the obvious element of the zero-sum nature of betting markets is clear, but for whatever reason, there's always discussions and overlap with positive sum markets and differentiation, but also trying to make analogies that don't always work. How do you think about the zero-sum nature? Does it have an enormous impact on everything you think about? Does it lead you to those decisions and theories and choices that seem to be sensible given that, or is there a better way to think about it?
Do you know what? Zero sum in terms of the life cycle of money within the system. People don't talk about sort of the total utility of the system. I suppose one of my concerns, I'm not sure whether this was sort of the area looking, but for me, one of the concerns is calculating the amount of misery caused by those people who aren't able to manage their gambling appropriately. The amount of people who derive entertainment factor, regardless of whether they win or lose from having a bet. Because I'm pretty sure the professionals, as long as they're winning, they're getting their utility out of it. And the bookmakers employ people, so their salary is being paid. So there is some societal utility being got out of that. But in terms of bookmaking as a whole, I definitely find myself wondering, and as I say, it's a lot of the talks about problem gambling that's going on at the moment. removing credit card deposits from bookmakers in the UK, these kind of areas. Definitely gets me thinking about the sum game in terms of overall benefit to the world. And to be in this game, I've got to be convinced that there is overall net positives there, and the entertainment value for many outweighs, justifies the existence of it all. I found it interesting that I want to say it was on Spanky's podcast where he was talking to Rufus Peabody, and he sort of blinded Rufus a little bit at one point towards the end of the podcast with, how do you justify basically that you add nothing to society as a professional gambler, which sort of got me thinking. And Rufus is doing his league of, treat professional gamblers like they're human beings, whatever it is. So, I'm sure he feels like he's giving something back there. But in terms of the money cycle of it all, I think people want to, in a weird way, thinking of it zero sum of, when professional gamblers talk about, betting with the bookmaker, you're betting with the Rex, and then the bookmaker's just sat in the middle, sort of taking the commission. Well, that's just, I think if it was a very cost-free exercise for the bookmaker to sit in that middle position, and it would be it'd feel more clear-cut. But, if basically just taking your clip is not enough to cover all your costs, then the bookmaker has to be, increasingly risk-taking. And if they've got to be increasingly risk-taking, they're not a pari-mutuel anymore. If they've got to be increasingly risk-taking, they've got to make sure that they're taking on the best possible risk they can. If they're an insurer, they've got to be selling the best insurance, best premium on their insurance. And so then they become as one with the professional gambler in wanting to, and then suddenly it becomes a question of competition. Do you want to compete with the professional gambler? If there's only so much pie and it's got to be all eaten, you want to make sure you get as much as possible. And the funny thing is that I think people think of like, exchanges even better. And it's like, well, if no one gets anything out of a sports bet other than the entertainment value potentially, it's not like the share, stocks and shares or whatever, where you actually hold something, then there's going to be a drain, a constant drain on that as people get spat out. And, taking just the commission on that, even then bookmakers are kind of like, right, to host this poker game, I've now got to have the fucking finest, cards, tables, chips, snacks for the game, goes up and up. Suddenly they've got to, find a way to either market make to the Rex internally, some people do that, or maybe, hosting just a plain old sports betting exchange with zero interference, no premium charges, no added costs or whatever. It's really hard to allow the zero sum nature to operate completely fluidly in that situation. I mean, right now I'm trying to as a way of keeping my mind active, sort of trying to market make on the exchanges, horse racing and greyhounds. So yeah, so if in the last few weeks any bet on any horse racing, yes, that includes Swedish trot or greyhounds, there's every chance you've been matched off against me. And one thing that's just so depressing is this market base rate. So everyone probably, well, I'd say everyone, some people probably click Betfair if you're in the UK territory or place like that. You get to choose what commission you pay and how much extra bonus crap you get. And if you choose 2%, you get zero extra bonus crap. But what a lot of people don't forget is there's the market base rate. And so in Australia, there's not just a higher market base rate for most horse racing tracks and dog tracks, but it wildly varies. And I speak to people who no fucking clue that some places are 10%. And you think to yourself, I think, again, if I have to read one more time, greedy Betfair, it's like, why do you think they charge 10%, commission on that? It's because someone's passing on that cost to you. And so it's sort of because I mean, it's fractured, isn't it? The Australian scene, isn't it? And there's so many costs that need to be sort of passed on.
Gets very complicated. I think that's one of the interesting things here in the US is you get into discussions about the peer-to-peer model, whatever variation of that it is, and it, at a very high level, in theory, on a napkin, it works. It works really well on a napkin, I must say. And then you get into the dynamics of the operational aspects, and I know the Australian market relatively well, what you're describing with respect to product fees on sports and how that even varies by sport. The race fields legislation and different fees that come from the horse racing industry, let's say. So, it can be very simple and then it gets very, very complicated very quickly. And that's why it is interesting when a lot of the discussions around the variation in products that are offered to the punters, the percentages, the ability to bet into those, and even talking to friends in Australia who bet, full time and want to bet on rugby league, and then they change the product fees at a league level, let's say, and there's not a lot that can be done, and there's intense negotiations, and it just takes it saps a lot of the simplicity out of the system when you have a lot of different aspects that you've got to control from an operational perspective. So anyway, I have a more general question, broad question for you, and it revolves around a lot of the tales and stories you see of people ascending through, on the betting side to making a fair bit of money, or seemingly making a fair bit of money, having a whiz-bang, computer model that's going to, outlast Bill Benter and all this type of thing. And then there is a sudden cliff that appears often. And I know you've probably seen this throughout the many years you've been involved. Just more broadly, as this is seemingly going to happen, or continue to happen, I should say, and a lot of it might be private, but what's your perspective on that? Because I know there's a lot of people that have that overconfidence and may have backtested, may have had one or two good seasons, and may come across what they think is a decade-long boon about to happen for them, and they're just trying to figure out how much money they can get down. It seems like once you do ascend, then things are going to get much more difficult, and it is, probably the best time to have a reality check rather than, buying a yacht in a private island and thinking about what, your late 20s are going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so the thing that I always find interesting is that when an edge is seen to be lost, people always want to diagnose what aspect of the edge was lost and sort of how they need an answer. So I don't know, let's say, what's an interesting example? So, the first people who are using sectional times in racing, or the first people who are using XG in soccer or whatever, they're almost a victim of their initial success. So they find it and they're like, shit, this is just printing money. I do not need to worry about anything ever again. And then suddenly they go through the bad half season, bad whole season, and they're like, right, it's fucked it. Clearly cat's out the bag. Well, I'm pretty sure the only reason I was any good was because of the XG or whatever it was. And now suddenly everyone's using it. And so it's gone. They're like, oh, I've heard bookmakers now have access to Opta data so they get better XG, whatever it may be. I can assure you that almost no edges evaporate due to individual actions by individual protagonists. So the idea that suddenly you were beating Pinnacle and then suddenly, Marco Bloom went out and bought some extra data packages and then Pinnacle rewrote their model and the edge was gone, that is far less likely than the ever-present, I suppose I might just call it absorption. So the market gets better, not because at any given point, any one of the participants within the market knows they're getting better. It simply happens because it's like a collective thought action, subconscious action. So everyone thinks like, oh, when this kind of data crept into the market, they didn't get the data. They got to see other bookmakers move their odds, and they got to see bets, and bets shaped behaviors, and behaviors turned into realizations that systematically you did this in these kind of scenarios wrong. And this absorption never really comes with this sort of eureka moment, I think. And people, the funny thing is people always assume that their model breaks in a eureka moment. And what is more likely is that your model was just overperforming. And what's doubly awful, I suppose, almost, is if you find yourself a good model that then goes on the most blazing hot streak ever, that sort of compounds it over and over. So, for me, it's like, I always use a really basic rule of thumb in that, if you're betting into, a market that's bet to 105%, two-way market, and you're thinking to yourself, right, so in implied probability terms, 2.5% defense on either side of the market, split that 5%. And it's like, when I predict probability using my model, there's almost a mirrored 2.5% on the other side. I can beat this. What's the likelihood I can beat someone who feels they only need 2.5% to defend themselves? What's the likelihood that I can beat them by more than reverse the full 5%? So basically, I can strip their price naked. So it's almost as if it's like, what are the odds? If we assume that the ever-present normal distributions that surround us, what are the odds that I can surpass that other side dramatically? And the truth is that normal distribution is not based around break even. It's based around, the bookmaker's own, overround. And, it's like, what are the odds that I can beat that so dramatically? It's like whenever you hear someone saying, yeah, no, I beat, NFL spreads by I made 8% ROI. It's like, well, that's never going you can never assume that that's about, and people are like, oh, well, I assume maybe 6% is more realistic. It's like, no, it's like the overround, the VIG or the juice, whatever you want to call it, what you bet into dictates, pretty much, what you can hope to achieve. And it's like, to the extent that if my bookmaker, if they've been betting, some league that I like betting on to 108 one year, and I started betting the following year, and they were betting it to 106, I already would assume not, fucking hell, I'm going to make more money this year. You've got to think, well, there's got to be a slight price confidence increase here. So chances are I'm going to be, beating this by less. And people who have great time. The worst thing is if you can have an absolute stormer in a really liquid, really well-priced sport, because the reality is that your natural edge may be 1% or 0.5%, which is fine. If you can get enough down. Believe me, you completely underestimate how much you need to get down at 0.5% in order to make it worthwhile. But there's something to be had there. But yeah, that people just immediately assume the bad season, that's it. And it's like, the reality is that a lot of the people who crash because there was nothing there at all before. But there's also some people who crash and could have carried on and made a meaningful 1-2%. And one of the things is, sports betting markets are semi-efficient. They're not fully efficient. And even some sports markets are closing, probably not the most liquid ones, but remain semi-efficient right to the end. And some of these biases can sometimes be, 0.5%, 1%. And people are like, why do these biases persist? And you've got to think about that. The only way to really remove those biases completely, in many ways, to have sort of loads of completely random actors, almost non-intentioned actors, like complete random so it's the wisdom of the crowds, but completely ignorant of what they're doing, is the way to sort of remove bias. Because anyone who builds a model to then market make, even if that market make doesn't have a strong true price behind it, maybe it just moves on the amount of bets they take or whatever, will get to a position where they, on average, across every situation, every market that they trade over and over again, they get to this position where on average they make good money, and you're terrified of breaking the machine. So you're like, well, I know in races with 5 dogs and a really short favorite, and it's like the moment you start overguessing that, you're worried you kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. So, and the reality is that your edge as a punter and your model may boil down to, these tiny percent edges, and you give up because you think the edge is gone. It only soaks up enough of your edge, sort of amorphously. It only soaks it up enough for your edge to shrink to a very small size where you give up. They don't need to send you into negative to fuck you off. They just need to get it down small enough that you don't think it's worth your while. And they're afraid of absorbing too much more of it because yesterday's XG, yesterday's shots on target is tomorrow's XG. So, they almost have to remain constantly imperfectly agile. It's like the system, to be really resilient, needs to have like a little bit of redundancy, a bit of flex in it, as opposed to being really hard. Punter models, really good punter models, are like often very sharp, volatile. They produce big running runs, big losing runs, these kind of things. They're precision implements with sort of high volatility, whereas the market you're betting into is sort of soft and mushy, and it's just sort of trying to roll around and adapt and roll. But it's basically you're building George Foreman and the market's Ali. It's rope-a-dope constantly, and the reality is that there's every chance that all it needs to do is survive until you stop throwing punches at it. And a lot of people, if they kept on throwing punches, could get their fair share of knockouts. But yeah, you see loads of people who give up to it. And the thing is unless you really know how good what you've got is, it's very hard not to be worried that you're going to just burn money indefinitely. And this is why a lot of people cling so firmly to closing line. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but closing line value provides this metric that you feel like it's okay to be losing money as far as I'm beating that. But at the same time, you could not be beating closing line value for a period. And then, because there's other people pushing on that jelly that's sort of wobbling around, they may actually push your edge a little bit back out to you because their edge is really fucking good and it's just destroying the market. And suddenly your edge, so it's just like, was it you were talking to, was it Dean? I forget who it was who was talking about weight handicapping versus speed and how much speed. Was it probably the last one you did, I think. But was talking about speed, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was Dean, or maybe Mark Lambon as well touched on it, but in the horse racing world, yeah.
They're absolutely right. I mean, I remember in like early 2000s when the top speed ratings from the Racing Post and everyone was talking about speed and everyone was reading, either Bear or More Than On Time and all these things. It's like, and they were crushing it and like, this is fucking going to live forever, and all these guys who were handicapping by weight, were probably like, fuck, I've gone from making 8% to like less than 1%. And can I be really sure that, 1% edge is even really an edge? And I give up. The reality is that they probably crushed out the angle only so far. And eventually the guys, and there's probably guys out there, I'd say probably, I know one of these cases where I know there are people who are handicapping the same way they do now that they did 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And you look at their charts and there's just ebbs and flows. And the ebbs and flows, people say like, oh, it's variance. It's like, it's probably not even variance. The ebb and flow is as the market has basically contracted and taken into their factors more or less. And it knows that vast majority of people are not going to do something for 20 years where the edge drops to like 0.5% for 2 years and then goes back up or whatever. But I love that. I completely believe that, yeah, if speeds are overdone, and, as I say, it's a super fragile area to be in, isn't it? Because if you know that all the best syndicates are coming up with their time numbers, and you know that the market is the product of 10 of the best time numbers in the whole world, you as one individual, your time numbers need to only drop off in accuracy like a fucking 0.1%, and you get shredded. You have to fight really, for a real fine level of accuracy. Whereas if you're like, okay, well, I can't compete in accuracy where 90% of the price comes from. But, if I can beat the remaining 10% by 10%, well, there's my 1%, and who knows, maybe that grows. Yeah. Sometimes I just tell people, just don't try and be a professional gambler at all.
Maybe that's the ultimate answer for this. Hundreds of episodes of this show. Ultimately, We distill it all down into one sentence: just don't be a professional gambler.
And yet I like so many of them. So,
So, final question for you around the topic of self-assessment. It comes up all the time with, assess your bets, make sure you assess your results, make sure you assess your process, assess your mindset, all these different things. And I read a Medium post you put out recently about an old article you put, I think, on the Pickio platform, and you went through some of the things you wrote years ago. Take us through that process, why you did it, and was it helpful? Did you gain anything from it?
well, I got reeled in, didn't I? That's the problem. In that someone said to me like, oh, someone pointed me like, have you seen this on Twitter? And I was like, no, I'm not on Twitter anymore. And they said, oh, look at this. Like, is this you that wrote this article? And I clicked, and I think it was, you can look at an account on Twitter, and I think it was pretty sure it was Pickio who posted it. And I was like, fuck, I thought to myself, how old is that? I still had it on my PC, and I said, how old is that article? And I looked down it and I read it, and the first thing that happened to me was I was like, oh, that's not too bad. I'm quite happy with what I wrote for that time, with that level of knowledge, for that level of experience, whatever it was. And then you just couldn't help. I just saw the Twitter comment, and someone had written something like, what the fuck does this guy know? What a fucking idiot. It was just one of those things where it's just like, oh God, just ignore it. And like, oh no. And so the only social media of any description I suppose I'm on is LinkedIn, because I like following industry news in particular for the betting. And LinkedIn is pretty good for following industry trade publications, that kind of stuff. And so I posted it, and I was like, it's like fucking, everyone's got great fucking hindsight, obviously 2020 hindsight. And like, I wrote this and I thought to myself, I want to kind of get out there. Not that anyone who ever followed me on Twitter probably links to me on LinkedIn. But I kind of want to get out there that, no, this is not, this I sort of had in my head, the back of my head, this guy's comment saying, this guy thinks he's says this about the Pinnacle model or whatever it was. And I was like, fuck, I don't know, I'm going to have to get and so I put it out there, and like within 2 comments on LinkedIn, someone had said, yeah, not bad, but fucking clueless about this. I'm like, fuck, so like, now I've been like really hooked in by that. And so I thought, oh, I'm going to just put a post on me. And I thought, why not? As an exercise, it'll be interesting. I think it was like 10-year-old article or something like that. I said, why not? As an exercise, let's go through what the 2010 me or whatever thought and compare it to what the 2020 person thinks, knows, whatever. And it was quite an interesting process. I think the one thing that people picked out was that we were talking about like sort of, so I was writing about this sort of high turnover, low margin exercise, and I'd done the cardinal sin of mentioning marathon. I mean, for the listeners who don't know, marathon, like for many years, probably to a degree now even, is considered like, a joke. People call it a joke bookmaker. Close your account super fast, all the rest of it. Now, it all depends on your definition of joke. I mean, largest online in Russia probably sees more turnover than fucking God, but they're definitely quick to close accounts if you win. So, definitely in the dressmaker category in that regard. And what people don't recognize is that now they bet to pretty keen margins. People have got no idea just how keen those margins were for a time. I mean, they were like betting stuff to 101, 102% across a huge wide range of things. And at that time, when I wrote that article, I was doing loads of research with odds portal data at the time. And you could see that like Marathon was basically updating their prices like fucking millions of times a match. This is pre-match, before the match started. And I was like, shit, there's no way a human is clicking all these price updates. And the only other person you knew that was pretty much going to move their price the moment you placed a bet at the time was Pinnacle. And still, they're one of the few people who does auto-move bets. And so I thought to myself, do you know what? How does one survive betting to 102, without either knowing what you're doing, whatever? And I didn't know so much. The funny thing is they had an office in Brighton in the UK and the main office in, I want to say it's St. Petersburg. And I'd spoke to some people in, the Brighton office, and it's like, yeah, no, it's like a black box. We don't know what goes on in Russia, whatever. Now, the reality is that I soon would learn, well, I'd say I would learn later on in life that the Russian market is one that's really keen on price. Most people don't bet basis on they're price insensitive, but the Russian market has got a really big thing on like discounting margins. They quite often will do so. KHL, biggest ice hockey league there. They'll quite often do like no juice, no vig, no over round games and things like that. And that margins are a really big thing in that market. All markets seem to have these little idiosyncrasies. So then I was like, oh, right. So, St. Petersburg HQ for marathon, that all makes sense why they're betting that. Well, I still thought to myself, do you know what? They're moving the price around pretty rapidly, quite a lot. And what was interesting was the signature of particularly tennis prices at the time for Pinnacle was that they were consistently, if ever you were going to be much lower margin than the rest, you're always going to be best price something with Pinnacle. Certainly at the time they were betting ATP really aggressively, and they were often the biggest price, the underdog. So the 5.5 with one bookmaker would be 6.5 at Pinnacle, and Marathon were even more extreme. So I was like, right, so they're almost pinned to the Pinnacle favorite price, but they're offering like 7 to that 6.5, and people at the time were like saying. The great thing is that people were saying like yeah, I took like 23.0 on something that was like 16.0. And I thought to myself, well, you know what? In implied probability terms, that's not actually that fucking massive. And then I started to think to myself, oh shit, maybe Marathon actually fucking onto something, or at least maybe the tennis is. And then I used to speak to the guys who did the on-court software, which is software that a lot of people used to use for tennis. A company called CanSoft, on-court, loads of statistics, and it's actually quite a cool piece of software. And so I thought to myself, oh, that's interesting. And they used to have historical odds. This is way before you could get really good historical odds detail. They had historical odds and in-play odds for every Pinnacle and Marathon. And I thought to myself, why the fuck have they got Marathon? And I thought to myself, oh, Russian. And I started to, slowly but surely, you put 2 and 2 together and maybe make 5. Like I say, I didn't know that much about the Russian market. But then you thought to yourself, well, maybe Marathon are terrible at some things, but for tennis, they're moving the price a shitload. They're betting to very low margins. They're either losing money hand over fist, but they've been around already for a few years at this point, in the UK market it was, or they might actually be onto something. So I pretty much alluded to in this article that these are people who might be trying to do very much just lay and move. Dynamic pricing, auto move pricing. And this is one of the things that was particularly picked out. Like, this guy thinks Marathon's pin. It's like, oh, fuck's sake. So at which point, I'm like, I'm then there, 3,000 words later, like, going through every single part of this thing. Like, what was my thinking then? And what was my thinking now? And I sincerely hope that people think like, oh, bookmaking hasn't changed. And it's like, it so has, but you're just not necessarily in the shop window. You don't see it from necessarily the views that someone like I would do. And what's interesting is you see all these things evolve, and often it takes time. So, the Asian market for soccer is, evolving. We're coming away from the agent era. We're going into more the direct online deposit. People can deposit by WeChat and shit. These things sort of quite glacial, and that's the beauty of the corona. Well, sorry, I don't want to sound horrible. There's no beauty in the coronavirus. But the fascinating thing about the bookmaking industry is in the space of 6 weeks, people have launched products that would have taken 2 years to launch. There's a huge evolving. You're actually seeing like margins that were higher than, the expectations. Let's say you bet something to 108, you were getting margins of 110. You're like, fucking hell, I wonder if that's sustainable. And then suddenly you're now getting margins back down to sort of close to what you would expect. And saying it's like, my God, you're literally seeing 10 years of sports betting evolution happen in a tiny fraction of time. But this article did allow me to look back and see what I have picked up, and it made me think to myself, oh, some things have changed over the last 10 years and things do evolve, even if they are boring fucking KYC things or other things that people don't really care about. People are like, God, so they invented like live streaming on the website for betting, and they invented like mobile betting, and then there's been no innovation, or like cash out. And then everyone's like, there's been no innovation ever since. It's like, well, the innovation doesn't need, it's like, no one's fucking thought to redefine chocolate cake. It's fucking great. It's a brilliant product. You don't really need to reinvent it. But, you get to this point where, you must understand, and people refuse to understand this a lot of the time, but for betting, fundamentally, like what worst mistake I find online for me, people may not even believe me when I say this, but betting is not about winning. And people don't bet. People may say they bet because they want to win or they want to become a winner or they want to win long term. But the deep actual neurological reason people enjoy betting is risk. We enjoy taking risk, and the enjoyment is proportional to the size of the risk. So it's like if you've ever stepped out into the road and the car's just literally almost taken your nose off, and that sort of almost rush of adrenaline that you survived. In the same way, the bigger you bet, and then, it's like when you chase, you have a whole day, you lost, and you're like, fuck, this is the last race of the day, I'm down $1,000. If you bet and you get back to zero, the fucking elation on that is just abnormal. It's like incredible. And it's the act of putting money at risk is the turn on, is the endorphin hit. Winning is not as powerful neurologically as the benefit we get when we put something at risk, when we take risk. So when you've got something that is as pure and simple in betting as that, literally, I have paid money, I get my hit, that's it. It's just literally, I don't need to receive a product. The money leaving my hand is the product. I've already had the nerves, the jangle. When people talk about sweating the game, I've never understood enjoying sweating a game. I think it's, just fucking horrible. Watching bets, I try never to watch any of my bets in the history of my life. But that people sort of talk about this, thrill of bets, and when people say like, oh, I still think the point is winning. It's like, again, you've got to experience different territories. Most fascinating thing ever is the Turkish market. Turkish massive gamblers. Not that it's fucking legal for the most part, but it's like massive gambling. Interestingly, certain parts of the Middle East. Backgammon, phenomenal gambling game. It's basically a vehicle. It's like the horse racing of games, really, in many ways. It's like a vehicle for gambling. Turks, huge backgammon fans, massive punters. And they are at their happiest when they've completely done their fucking bollocks. Absolutely love mouthing off to all their mates, and I'm making a mass cultural stereotype. I do realize this, and I apologize to any Turks listening who think this is not the way Turkish culture is. But from my observations, they're absolutely proud that they've dropped a massive amount of money. And it's almost like a point of pride to tell other people, I'm so fucking rich, I can afford to have lost this much money. It's like, have you ever lost $5,000 in a day? You fucking haven't, 'cause you're fucking useless. And so when you get people who can get so much, and it's in microcosm in the UK, in the pub, what makes the better story? Like, yeah, so I had a $5 on this 10-team accumulator and it won. Well, fucking cheers, aren't you lucky, prick? But versus I had £5 on this 10-team accumulator, right? 9 are in, yeah. 10th, yeah. So 2-0 up, 3-2, 3 goals in injury time. Fuck, it's just the best thing. So when you've got a product where win or lose, it's fantastic. Yeah, who fucking needs innovation?
Well, I've never won the lottery, but I'm guessing if you bought a $1 ticket and you won $1 million, that feeling would be fine, I'm sure. But if you are at the racetrack and it's the last race of the day anywhere in the country somehow, and the casinos are closed and there's no other option, and you're down to your last 50 and you started with 5,000 or 500, doesn't matter, and you turn that 50 into 10,000, there couldn't be a better feeling. And I think most people would understand the gravity of that versus the $1 lottery ticket where you win the lottery and you might win $1 million. But I would say that 10,000 on the last race of the day is more elation and endorphins.
They even have, rails bookmakers, it's even got its own term. It's like, how much are you having on this bet? Getting out stakes. So basically, what have I lost? What horse am I betting? Divide what I've lost by the odds of the horse I'm betting. That's my stake. Yeah. It's like that. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, as always, it's a pleasure to chat. I know it's never enough time, and hopefully round 3 of this will be as interesting for me, and I'm sure many who are listening. Good luck with the Bundesliga coming up, and then everything else you got going on. And hopefully, again, we can do this sometime soon.
Pleasure, Jake.